Hello, everyone. So this was work that I did in collaboration with my advisor, John Criswell, while I was a PhD student at University of Rochester. So whatever your flavor of software security, whether it's type safety in Rust or user authentication or file access control, all these software-enforced security policies commonly rely on the correctness of the hardware below it to maintain their security policies. Now, in this talk, we'll be discussing new threats that are arising from an untrusted hardware supply chain that's threatening to place hardware Trojans, which are malicious alterations to hardware designs. So over here, I've depicted a very simplified version of the hardware supply chain, and namely two stages that we'll be talking about relevant to this talk. The first is the HDL or RTL design stage, where designers, either in-house or third parties, would be designing hardware designs in languages like Verilog. And bad actors at this stage could inject Trojans simply as lines of Verilog code and manifest these attacks. Now, after you package up your Verilog, you perform synthesis, you send essentially a geometric representation to a foundry, where bad actors at an untrusted foundry could inject Trojans with as little as a single capacitor and enable devastating attacks. Now finally, going to deployment, you'd have your package shipped, assembled into a server somewhere and deployed, where you launch your software applications and they're still under the attack of other attackers, let's say over the network or radio and so on. So we know how to protect against these kinds of attackers. We know that while we're designing hardware components, such as cryptographic cores, user privilege separation, and so on, that these are inherently security critical. They're security critical by design, and they afford very high scrutiny, which causes us to vet them to ensure that they maintain their safety properties. So we have very good ways of doing this. One example is annotated hardware design languages, where, as you can see on the figure here, you associate signals in a hardware design with security criticality labels. So in the code snippet on your left, you'll see timer and data having associated low security, and key, which could presumably be a secret key, having high security. Following that, static analysis could ensure that your secret keys don't leak out through untrusted outputs, and your critical control bits, such as privilege bits, aren't controlled by untrusted inputs. Pushing that even further, developments in proof-carrying hardware ensure that third parties who are licensing their hardware designs don't need to distribute their source code. They can simply distribute proofs that their designs do not implement Trojans. So this landscape looks very secure. There doesn't seem to be any room for attackers to place Trojans here, because we can very well vet our hardware and enforce security. And with that, I don't know, there's nothing to do here. It doesn't seem like attackers have any room, but big surprise, we're only 3 minutes into the talk. I'll show you why that's not the case. So we observe that software-enforced security policies maintain their properties using general-purpose hardware. And we'd look specifically at compilers that inject runtime checks. As mentioned in the talk previous to this, the Rust compiler would inject bounce checks prior to a buffer dereference. So in the figure here on your right, you'll see a buffer dereference using the index I assigned to the value C. This buffer is located on the stack, and preceding the buffer dereference, the Rust compiler, for example, any safe programming language compiler would inject an instruction sequence that prevents an access outside the bounds of the buffer while dereferencing the buffer. So if I is greater than the length of the buffer, control would be transferred to a panic handler, and the program would fail closed. Now, these provide a very convenient target for Trojans because they're highly reproducible code sequences. Trojans can tamper with them to induce memory safety vulnerabilities, as we know can launch very powerful attacks. And these provide attackers very similar capabilities to classical Trojans. But they have the very interesting property of hiding in general purpose hardware, where there's much more of it. There's much more general purpose hardware than the designated security critical hardware. So it'll be very hard to catch these kinds of Trojans. So let's take a look at our threat model. We have rogue designers attempting to place Trojans in our SOC. They will forego any changes, any tampering with security critical units like trusted execution engines, cryptographic cores, memory protections, and so on. Rather, they'll choose to attack general purpose hardware like ALUs, reorder buffers, and so on. Further, we assume that attackers can interface with our safe programs, our victim applications, let's say over the network, over radio, or being co-located on a VM. So thank you to the previous talk for brushing us up on our Rust. We have a very simple Rust snippet over here that's just copying data from an input array to a local buffer that's on the stack. And now let's assume for a second that an attacker has influence over the indexing expression through the variable j, and it can control some of the input, let's say with network packets. And the attacker would attempt to overwrite the return address. Now we know that we have a bounce check in place, and I'll briefly go over what these instructions do. So the first instruction, the move instruction, loads from the stack the value of the computed index into the register IDX. The second instruction compares the length of the buffer to that index, and the next three instructions, the set, test, and jump not equal, will manipulate carry flags such that control will be transferred to the panic handler if the access is beyond the bounds of the buffer. Now, let's design our Trojan, now that we know what our victim looks like. So here we have our bounce check again, identical to the one we had before. And now we have this criteria where we want to minimize complexity so that our Trojan doesn't get detected. So let's take this example of tampering with the first operand for the comparison instruction. What this does is effectively fools the bounce check into thinking that the buffer is much larger than it actually is. And now, in the words of all our advisors, you can do better. You're corrupting too many bits. So let's instead corrupt the flag, which is effectively corrupting a single bit that is the output of the comparison instruction. And this would have a very similar result, but only tampers with a single bit, which is much better than before. Another challenge is that these Trojans must distinguish bounce checking instructions from the other instructions in the dynamic instruction stream of normal operation on the processor. These payloads must be delivered very precisely so that you don't incur any instability on the system during normal operation. So we want to find, for example, this comparison instruction that corresponds to a bounce check and avoid the other comparison instructions under normal behavior. So we devise an interactive trigger, which is, it'll use the memory address for our victim instructions as a unique identifier. And we'll have a covert interface that's implemented with an add instruction to arm the Trojan to prepare to deliver its payload. So the Trojan is going to snoop for in-flight add instructions. When the first operand matches a value that was hard-coded at hardware design time, it'll store the second operand into internal storage. And now the Trojan will be armed, searching for in-flight instructions. That'll be our victim instructions. And when it hits a match on our victim instruction, then it'll deliver the payload. So with these challenges, also read our paper because we have a much more interesting Trojan. My advisor tells me he finds this one more interesting, the one in the paper, but it also has the benefit of skipping the arming stage of the Trojan, where it can dynamically recognize bounce checks in progress. So as I alluded to before, there's so many ways we can tamper with bounce checks. It's in general purpose hardware. There's 5 instructions that we can play with, so let's look at something a bit more interesting. As before, we have our bounce check on the right. We have our buffer access the same as before, and we have a simple 5-stage pipeline that wants to tamper with a jump not equal to instruction. And what we're going to do here is tamper with the speculation logic. So first, the attacker is going to train the branch predictor to allow the bounce check to pass. So this jump not equal to will predict not taken. That is, the jump not equal to will transfer control to the buffer access, not the panic handler. Then the attacker will force an out-of-bounds buffer dereference. The jump not equal to will enter the fetch stage. It'll be predicted not taken. That is, let's predict that the the bounce check is going to pass. The jump not equal to will reach the execute stage where branch resolution occurs. Branch resolution will resolve that branch as misspeculated. We were supposed to take that branch. So let's squash the misspeculated state. At this point, the Trojan intercepts that signal, preventing the processor from reverting to an earlier checkpoint, and the jump not equal to proceeds to the end of the pipeline and commits this tampered state where the jump not equal to passed the bounce check. At that point, we've induced a memory safety vulnerability with our Trojan, and the attacker can exploit the program and launch a control flow hijacking attack. So we implemented our prototypes over 2 platforms. We have 4 attacks ranging from 3 on a Gem 5 core, that's a large out-of-order core, and with the full system simulation, we could demonstrate that tampering with this by using the Trojan to tamper with this application, we could spawn a new shell, allowing an attacker arbitrary code execution. We also have a prototype on the RISC-V boom core, which is again a realistic, large, out-of-order core. This platform was limited to running bare metal victim applications. However, it gave us a much more precise measurement of the Trojan. And you can read about all the prototypes in our paper, but I'll just be going over the evaluation of our RISC-V prototype. So as you can see here, we added a measly 3 lines of code in Chisel to implement the Trojan and an order of 100 logic gates. And both these comprise less than 1,000% of the hardware design. That's incredibly small. And it can similarly be noticed from the power measurements, which were so small that we did not have to make any adjustments to the default configuration of the boom core. This fit very comfortably in the existing timing and power budget for the core. So I hope you're all scared now and you can ask me how I'll save the world.